Blood dripped from Raymond's hand as he stared at the shattered phone. Just 20 minutes ago, he'd been a respected doctor returning home with his wife. Now, an entire airplane watched in horror as security dragged him away, all because he refused to give up his seat. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their skin color, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of justice prevailing against discrimination. Now, let's discover how a simple flight home turned into a battle for respect that would change an entire airline forever. The morning had started perfectly. Raymond Johnson adjusted his designer tie as he gazed out the window of the Paris Charles de Gaulle airport. At 63, with silver-flecked hair and distinguished features, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent 4 decades saving lives as one of Atlanta's premier cardiologists. Beside him, his wife Evelyn, elegant in her tailored navy dress, reviewed their boarding passes with a satisfied smile. "First class all the way home, just as we promised ourselves," she said, squeezing his arm affectionately. "A perfect end to a perfect anniversary." Raymond nodded, allowing himself to relax into the moment. Their 40th anniversary trip to Paris had been everything they'd dreamed of: romantic dinners overlooking the Seine, morning walks through Montmartre, evenings at the opera. They'd splurged on this trip, including the first-class tickets for the long flight home to Atlanta. After decades of hard work building his cardiology practice and raising their children, they deserved this luxury. "Remember that little cafe where the owner kept bringing us extra pastries?" Raymond chuckled, his deep voice warm with the memory. "How could I forget? You spoke such terrible French he took pity on us," Evelyn laughed, the corners of her eyes crinkling. 40 years of marriage had only deepened their connection, each shared laugh a testament to their enduring bond. As they approached the gate, Raymond felt the familiar shift in his posture. An unconscious straightening of his spine, a slight lift of his chin. It was the adjustment he'd made thousands of times throughout his life and career, the silent armor he donned when entering spaces where people like him weren't always welcome. Even as a respected physician, Raymond was never allowed to forget he was a black man in America. The gate agent smiled professionally as she scanned their boarding passes. "Welcome, Dr. and Mrs. Johnson. You're in seats 2A and 2B. We're beginning priority boarding now, so you're welcome to board first." Raymond nodded politely, guiding Evelyn toward the jet bridge. As they entered the aircraft, a flight attendant named Heather greeted them with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard," she said, barely glancing at their boarding passes. "Economy section is, we're in first class," Raymond interrupted gently, gesturing to their boarding passes. "Seats 2A and 2B. A flicker of surprise crossed Heather's face before she quickly composed herself. "Of course. Right this way." Raymond felt the familiar twinge in his chest, the one that appeared whenever someone made assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. Evelyn's hand tightened around his, a silent communication developed over decades. They'd been through this countless times before. The first-class cabin was a picture of luxury: wide leather seats, ample legroom, and attentive service. As they settled in, Raymond couldn't help but notice the curious glances from other passengers, all white, some poorly disguising their surprise at seeing the Johnsons in the premium section. Raymond took a deep breath and focused on getting comfortable. He stowed their carry-ons, helped Evelyn with her seat belt, and accepted the pre-flight champagne offered by another flight attendant. These small rituals helped calm the unease that never quite left him in such situations. Through the cabin windows, they watched as other passengers began boarding. The coach section filled quickly, a steady stream of travelers making their way through the aircraft. Among them, Raymond noticed a well-dressed white couple in their 50s arguing with a gate agent at the entrance to the plane. "I don't understand why our seats were changed," the man was saying, his voice carrying through the cabin. "We specifically requested first class. Do you know who I am?" The woman beside him, blonde and impeccably dressed, tapped her expensive heel impatiently. "This is completely unacceptable. We don't fly economy. Raymond and Evelyn exchanged glances but said nothing. They'd seen entitled behavior before, and it wasn't their concern. They were finally heading home after a wonderful vacation. Nothing could spoil their mood now. Or so they thought. Heather, the flight attendant who had initially directed them to economy, returned to the first-class cabin with a strained smile. Behind her followed a man in a dark uniform with "Blake Thompson, cabin supervisor," embroidered on his jacket. Something in their demeanor immediately put Raymond on alert. After decades of navigating predominantly white spaces, he developed a sixth sense for when trouble was brewing. As they approached his seat, Raymond noticed Heather's eyes darting nervously between him and the supervisor. Whatever was coming, it wasn't good. The argument at the gate was about to become very much their concern. "Excuse me, sir, madam," Blake said, addressing Raymond and Evelyn with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We have a slight situation with the seating arrangements. We need to ask if you'd be willing to move to different seats." Raymond straightened in his seat, immediately wary. "Different seats? We booked these specific seats months ago." "Yes, well," Blake continued, lowering his voice as if sharing a confidence, "we have some very important passengers who need to be accommodated in first class. We can offer you seats in economy plus, with extra legroom." Evelyn frowned. "I don't understand. We paid for first class." Blake's smile tightened. "Of course, and we'd provide a partial refund for the difference." Raymond noticed the white couple from the gate now hovering nearby, watching the interaction with obvious interest. The pieces fell into place immediately. "These are our assigned seats," Raymond said firmly, pulling out their boarding passes. "We booked and paid for first class." Blake's professional demeanor slipped slightly. "Sir, I understand, but Mr. and Mrs. Wilson here," he gestured to the waiting couple, "are very important clients of the airline. Mr. Wilson is a major donor to our parent company." Greg Wilson stepped forward, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive suit. His wife Patricia stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed expectantly. "Look," Greg said with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way, "this is clearly a mix-up. Those are our seats. We always fly first class." Raymond felt his blood pressure rising but kept his voice steady. "There's no mix-up. These are our assigned seats, which we booked and paid for months ago." Blake shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy anyway. The service is quite good there too." The implication hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Raymond felt the familiar burn of indignation rising in his chest. Around them, other first-class passengers, all white, were pretending not to listen, though a few exchanged uncomfortable glances. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Raymond asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Blake flushed slightly. "I just meant that we don't look like we belong in first class." Raymond finished for him. "Is that what you're suggesting?" Evelyn placed a restraining hand on his arm. After 40 years of marriage, she knew exactly when his anger was building. "Raymond," she murmured. "No, Evelyn," he said firmly. "I want to hear him say it." The cabin had grown uncomfortably quiet. Even the boarding passengers had slowed, sensing the tension. Patricia Wilson sighed dramatically. "Can we please resolve this quickly? We're holding up the entire flight." Blake turned to the Wilsons with an apologetic smile before facing Raymond again, his expression hardening. "Sir, I'm simply trying to accommodate all our passengers. If you could just cooperate." "We are cooperating," Raymond interrupted. "We're sitting in our assigned seats." Greg Wilson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know if you people understand how this works, but there's a certain way things are done. I've been a platinum member of this airline for 15 years. Raymond stiffened at the phrase, "you people," a dog whistle he'd heard countless times throughout his life. "And I've been a cardiologist for 35 years, he replied evenly. Neither fact changes our seat assignments. Around them, flight attendants moved through the cabin, pretending not to notice the confrontation but exchanging worried glances. One young black flight attendant, her name tag reading Jasmine, watched the scene with unconcealed concern. Greg's face reddened. "Do you know who I am? I can have you banned from this airline with one phone call." Raymond had faced this type of intimidation before. As a young medical student in the 1980s, he'd been told repeatedly he didn't belong. As the only black resident in his program, he'd been mistaken for janitorial staff more times than he could count. Even now, patients occasionally requested a different doctor upon seeing him, despite his impressive credentials. "I don't care who you are," Raymond said quietly. "And your threats don't change the facts. These are our seats." Blake's professional veneer cracked further. "Sir, I'm trying to be reasonable here. Mr. Wilson is an important business partner of the airline. And we are paying customers," Evelyn interjected, her voice calm but firm. "With confirmed seats in this cabin." Other passengers were now openly watching, some with phones discreetly recording. The confrontation was becoming a spectacle, exactly what Raymond had spent his life trying to avoid. But some lines couldn't be crossed, some indignities couldn't be tolerated, not anymore, not at his age, not after everything he'd accomplished. "Look," Blake said, his patience visibly thinning, "we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These arrangements need to be made." "Are you threatening us?" Raymond asked incredulously. "I'm simply explaining the reality of the situation," Blake replied coldly. Greg Wilson smirked slightly, the expression of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Know your place," he muttered, just loud enough for Raymond to hear. Those 3 words, loaded with centuries of history and oppression, hit Raymond like a physical blow. He'd heard them before, in various forms, throughout his life. In school hallways. In hospital corridors. In country clubs and restaurants. The message was always the same: no matter his accomplishments, some people would always see his skin first. Raymond's mind flashed back to his first day of medical school, when a professor had asked if he was lost, assuming he couldn't possibly be a student. To the time a patient had refused his care, requesting a real doctor. To countless small humiliations and slights that he'd swallowed over the years for the sake of peace, for the sake of progress, for the sake of not being labeled difficult or angry. But not today. Not anymore. "Our place," Raymond said with quiet dignity, "is in these seats. And we're not moving." The standoff had drawn the attention of everyone in the first-class cabin. Even passengers still boarding slowed as they passed, sensing the tension. Blake's jaw tightened as he realized this wasn't going to be resolved easily. "I need to speak with the captain," he said curtly, turning on his heel. As Blake disappeared into the cockpit, Greg Wilson leaned over Raymond's seat. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I've got friends in high places." Raymond held his gaze steadily. "So do I. And none of them would expect me to give up a seat I paid for because of someone else's entitlement. Would you stand your ground if you were in Raymond's position? Comment number 1 if you believe he's right to refuse moving, or number 2 if you think he should have compromised to avoid conflict. Don't forget to hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination and wished someone would take a stand. The cockpit door opened, and Blake emerged with the captain, a stern-looking man in his 50s named Captain Howard Miller. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Miller asked, his eyes scanning the situation. Before Raymond could speak, Blake jumped in. "These passengers are refusing to cooperate with a seating reassignment, Captain. They're causing a disruption." "We're not causing any disruption," Raymond objected. "We're sitting in our assigned seats and being asked to move without cause." Captain Miller frowned. "Sir, if my flight crew has asked you to change seats, I expect compliance. We can't have passengers disrupting the boarding process." "With all due respect, Captain," Raymond replied, his voice steady, the only disruption is coming from your staff trying to move us from seats we booked and paid for months ago. The issue, Greg Wilson interjected smoothly, is that there's been a mix-up with the seating assignments. My wife and I were supposed to be in first class. Captain Miller turned to Blake. Is that true? Was there a booking error? Blake hesitated. Not exactly, sir. The Wilsons were initially booked in economy, but, given Mr. Wilson's relationship with the airline, we felt an accommodation was appropriate. Raymond noticed Jasmine, the young black flight attendant, hovering nearby with a troubled expression. She caught his eye briefly, her gaze communicating silent understanding. So you're asking paying customers to downgrade because someone else wants their seats? Raymond clarified. Not because of any actual booking error. Captain Miller's expression hardened. Sir, I don't appreciate your tone. On this aircraft, I have final authority, and I'm asking you to comply with my crew's instructions. Your crew's instructions are discriminatory, Raymond stated firmly. A ripple went through the cabin at the word discriminatory. A white businessman across the aisle, who had been watching the entire interaction, pulled out his phone and began openly recording. Put that away, Blake snapped at him. I'm Warren Mitchell, an attorney, the man replied calmly. And I believe I'm witnessing something that needs documentation. Greg Wilson stepped forward aggressively. This is ridiculous. No one is discriminating against anyone. This is about airline loyalty and customer status. Is that why your first question wasn't whether we were also frequent flyers? Evelyn asked pointedly. She turned to the captain. My husband has platinum status with this airline. He flies internationally for medical conferences regularly. Captain Miller looked uncomfortable. That may be, ma'am, but his status doesn't count the same as Mr. Wilson's. Evelyn pressed. Raymond noticed Evelyn's hand trembling slightly as she clutched her purse. Her face had paled, and she was breathing more rapidly than normal. As a cardiologist, he recognized the signs immediately. The stress was affecting her health. Are you okay? He asked quietly, turning away from the confrontation. Just a little chest pain, she whispered. It's probably nothing. Alarm bells rang in Raymond's mind. How long? Since this started, she admitted. Raymond turned to the captain. My wife needs medical attention. She's experiencing chest pains. Blake rolled his eyes visibly. Convenient timing. I'm a cardiologist, Raymond snapped. This isn't something to dismiss. You're a doctor. Captain Miller asked skeptically, looking Raymond up and down as if reassessing him. The implication was clear, and it stung. Even in a medical emergency, his credentials were being questioned because of his skin color. Yes, I'm a cardiologist at Atlanta Memorial, Raymond replied tersely. Now, my wife needs aspirin and monitoring. Her heart rate is elevated. Jasmine stepped forward. I can get the medical kit, Captain. As she moved to retrieve it, Greg Wilson lost his patience. This is clearly a delay tactic. They're just trying to avoid moving. Raymond stood up abruptly, his patience finally snapping. My wife's health is not a tactic. Back off, now. The sudden movement caused Greg to step back, bumping into another passenger. The tension in the cabin ratcheted up several notches. Captain Miller raised his hands. Sir, I need you to sit down and lower your voice immediately. What's happening? Jasmine asked, returning with the medical kit. They're making a scene, Blake replied. The captain needs to make a decision. Jasmine hesitated, then leaned closer to Raymond. They do this sometimes, she whispered. The Wilsons were booked in economy. They demanded an upgrade at the gate, and when they were told the flight was full, they pulled the "Do you know who I am?" card. Her information confirmed what Raymond had suspected, but before he could respond, Blake noticed their exchange. Jasmine, return to your duties, he ordered sharply. Raymond reached for his phone. "I'm calling my attorney." Greg Wilson lunged forward, grabbing for Raymond's phone. "You're not calling anyone. You're holding up this entire flight." In the scuffle, the phone slipped from Raymond's hand, crashing to the floor. The screen shattered instantly. When Raymond instinctively reached out to grab Greg's wrist, preventing him from touching the broken device, his thumbnail caught the man's skin, leaving a small scratch. Greg Wilson recoiled dramatically. "He attacked me. Did you all see that? He assaulted me. Blood from the minor scratch. Barely more than a paper cut, beaded on Greg's wrist. But his reaction was as if he'd been stabbed. "That's it," Captain Miller declared. "I'm having you removed from this flight. Security." Raymond looked around in disbelief as cabin crew called for security. Evelyn clutched her chest, her breathing now visibly labored. Warren, the attorney, continued recording, capturing everything. "This is wrong, and you all know it," Raymond said, looking around the cabin at the uncomfortable faces of the other passengers. Not one spoke up in their defense. "Do you think the other passengers should have intervened? Type number 1 if you believe bystanders have a responsibility to speak up against injustice, or number 2 if you think they were right to stay out of it. And if you're enjoying this true story of courage in the face of discrimination, make sure to subscribe for more powerful content like this." As security officers boarded the plane, Raymond wondered how a perfect anniversary trip had dissolved so quickly into this nightmare. But even as they approached to escort him off, one thing was certain: this fight was far from over. The security officers, two burly men with stern expressions, marched down the aisle toward Raymond and Evelyn. The entire plane had fallen silent, the only sounds the gentle hum of the aircraft's systems and Evelyn's labored breathing. "Sir, ma'am, you need to gather your belongings and come with us," the lead officer stated flatly. Raymond stood his ground. "My wife needs medical attention. She's experiencing cardiac symptoms." The officer glanced at Evelyn, whose complexion had turned ashen, then looked to Captain Miller for guidance. "We can have medical personnel meet you in the terminal," the captain said dismissively. "Right now, you need to leave the aircraft." Raymond felt a cold fury building inside him. "She needs attention now. Not after you've paraded us through the terminal like criminals." "Sir," the security officer said, his hand moving to rest on his taser, "don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Raymond looked around the cabin one last time, meeting the eyes of the other passengers. Some looked away in shame, others stared with undisguised curiosity, but none spoke up. The silence of bystanders, he'd experienced it his entire life. "Fine," Raymond said finally. "But I want everyone to understand what's happening here. We're being removed because we refuse to give up seats we paid for to accommodate someone else's sense of entitlement." As he helped Evelyn to her feet, Jasmine approached quickly. "Let me help with your bags," she offered, leaning close as she reached for the overhead bin. In that moment, she slipped a small piece of paper into Raymond's pocket. "I saw everything," she whispered. "My number. I want to help." Warren, the attorney still recording, called out, "I have all of this documented. I'll send you the footage." "This isn't right." Blake stepped between them. "Sir, please stop recording. It's against airline policy." "Actually," Warren replied calmly, "there's no law or policy preventing passengers from recording incidents that don't interfere with crew member duties. I'm well within my rights." Raymond nodded gratefully to Warren as he gathered their belongings. Every eye in the cabin was on them as they made their way down the aisle, Evelyn leaning heavily on his arm, her breathing becoming more labored with each step. The walk of shame through the crowded economy section was excruciating. Hundreds of curious faces watching as they were escorted off like criminals. "Raymond," Evelyn whispered, her voice tight with pain, "I don't feel well." "Just a little further," he encouraged her, shooting a concerned glance at the security officers. "My wife really needs medical attention," he repeated. The lead officer's expression softened slightly. Medical staff will meet us at the gate. As they emerged from the jet bridge into the terminal, Evelyn stumbled. Raymond caught her, easing her into a nearby seat. "We need help now," he shouted, loosening her collar. "She's having cardiac symptoms." A small crowd gathered as Raymond knelt beside Evelyn, taking her pulse. His medical training kicked in, overriding his anger and humiliation. Rapid and irregular, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Evelyn, are you still having chest pain?" She nodded weakly. "Radiating to my left arm now." Cold fear washed over Raymond. These were textbook heart attack symptoms. He looked up at the gathering airport staff. "I need aspirin and an AED, now. She's showing signs of a cardiac event." "Sir, calm down," one of the airport employees said. "Medical assistance is on the way." "I am calm," Raymond replied tersely. "I'm also a cardiologist, and I'm telling you my wife is showing signs of a heart attack. Every minute matters." The employee hesitated, clearly unsure whether to believe him. Raymond had encountered this doubt countless times in his career, people questioning his expertise because of his skin color. But never had the stakes been so personal. "Please," he said, forcing himself to soften his tone. "Just get me an aspirin at minimum." After what seemed an eternity, a young staff member returned with a first aid kit. Raymond quickly found the aspirin and gave one to Evelyn. The security officers stood nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "Medical response is backed up," one of them muttered. "Could be another 10 minutes. Raymond knew that in cardiac events, minutes could mean the difference between life and death. Without hesitating, he pulled out his personal phone and dialed 911. "This is Dr. Raymond Johnson at Gate C-42, Charles de Gaulle Airport. I have a 62-year-old female presenting with chest pain radiating to the left arm, shortness of breath, and diaphoresis. Probable myocardial infarction. We need emergency medical services immediately." As he spoke to emergency services, Raymond was acutely aware of the crowd watching them, the same people who had witnessed their humiliation now gawking at Evelyn's distress. Among them, he spotted Greg and Patricia Wilson, who had apparently also been removed from the flight during the commotion. Greg was gesturing animatedly to an airline representative, still playing the victim with his bandaged wrist. Finally, airport paramedics arrived with a stretcher and equipment. Raymond quickly briefed them on Evelyn's symptoms, once again facing the momentary doubt in their eyes when he identified himself as a cardiologist. But Evelyn's condition spoke for itself, and they quickly sprang into action, attaching monitors and starting in 4. BP 160/95, heart rate 110 and irregular, one paramedic announced. ECG shows ST elevation. Raymond's worst fears were confirmed. Evelyn was indeed having a heart attack. As they prepared to transport her to the hospital, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Warren, the attorney from the plane. "I got everything," Warren said quietly, showing Raymond the video on his phone. "What they did was wrong. The video is already getting attention online." He handed Raymond a business card. "Call me when you can." Raymond nodded gratefully, too focused on Evelyn to fully process the implications. As the paramedics wheeled Evelyn toward the ambulance, Raymond heard a commotion behind him. Turning, he saw Jasmine arguing with Blake and another airline supervisor. "This was wrong, and you know it," she was saying, her voice carrying across the terminal. Raymond wanted to intervene, to protect this young woman who had stood up for them, but Evelyn needed him more. With one last grateful look toward Jasmine, he hurried after the paramedics, his heart heavy with worry and rage. In the ambulance, holding Evelyn's hand as the paramedics worked around them, Raymond was torn between staying by her side and fighting the injustice they'd just experienced. For now, Evelyn was his priority. But as the ambulance sped toward the hospital, sirens blaring, Raymond made a silent promise to himself and to her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The emergency room at Hôpital Européen Georges Pompidou was a flurry of activity as medical staff responded to Evelyn's condition. Raymond stood back, simultaneously a concerned husband and a medical professional, watching as the French doctors and nurses worked efficiently. His fluent French, learned during a fellowship year in Paris decades ago, helped bridge any communication gaps. ST elevation in leads V2 through V5, the attending cardiologist told Raymond, showing him the ECG readout. We're taking her directly to the cath lab. Raymond nodded, recognizing the signs of an anterior wall myocardial infarction, a serious heart attack affecting the front wall of the heart. Thank you, he said, squeezing Evelyn's hand one last time before they wheeled her away. Left alone in the waiting area, the adrenaline that had kept him focused began to subside, leaving room for the rage and humiliation to flood back. He pulled out his phone. Not the shattered one from the plane incident but his backup international phone, and saw dozens of notifications. Warren's video had indeed gone viral, with the hashtag #FlyingWhileBlack trending on Twitter. The airline had already issued a statement, "We are aware of an incident involving disruptive passengers on Flight 2207 from Paris to Atlanta. The safety and comfort of all passengers is our top priority, and we do not tolerate behavior that interferes with flight operations. We are investigating the matter fully." The corporate doublespeak made Raymond's blood boil. Disruptive passengers, as if they had been the aggressors rather than the victims. He was composing a response when his phone rang. It was Calvin Jenkins, his attorney back in Atlanta, already aware of the situation. "Raymond, I've seen the video," Calvin said without preamble. "This is outrageous. How's Evelyn?" "In the cath lab," Raymond replied, his voice tight. "Anterior MI. Stress-induced, almost certainly." "I'm so sorry," Calvin said. "Listen, I've already reached out to our contacts in Paris. We've got a local attorney heading to the hospital to support you. And I'm working on the airline situation from this end." "They called us disruptive passengers," Raymond said bitterly. "Typical defensive posture," Calvin replied. "They'll retract it once we're done. This isn't their first rodeo with discrimination claims, Raymond. This airline has a history." Raymond wasn't surprised. "What do you recommend?" "For now, focus on Evelyn. Let me handle the initial response. But start documenting everything while it's fresh, every detail of the interaction, every name you remember. And save any communication from witnesses." After hanging up, Raymond did exactly that, typing out a meticulous account of the incident while waiting for news about Evelyn. 3 hours later, the cardiologist returned with good news. "We placed 2 stents in her left anterior descending artery," he explained. "The procedure went well. She's stable and awake. You can see her now." In the recovery room, Evelyn looked pale but alert. Her eyes found Raymond's immediately, and she reached for his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I should have just moved. None of this would have happened." Evelyn squeezed his hand weakly. "Don't you dare apologize for standing up for us. For standing up for what's right." Before they could talk further, a nurse entered with a tablet. "Dr. Johnson. You might want to see this." The nurse showed him a news site where Warren's video had been embedded. The headline read, "Respected doctor and wife removed from flight after refusing to give up seats to white couple." The video had over 5 million views already. "You're famous in our hospital," the nurse said with a small smile. "Many of the staff have seen it. We're all on your side." Throughout the afternoon, Raymond received a steady stream of messages from colleagues, friends, and even former patients who had seen the video. His hospital administration in Atlanta reached out, offering support and resources. Several of his colleagues had even booked flights to Paris to come support them. In stark contrast to their treatment on the plane, the hospital staff in Paris treated them with utmost respect and care. Raymond couldn't help but notice the difference. here, in his professional element, his credentials were not questioned. His expertise was recognized and valued. Around 6 in the evening, Calvin called again. The airline's CEO, James Harrington, just issued a personal statement. They're claiming it was all a misunderstanding, and that you became confrontational when asked to assist with a seating issue. That's a bald-faced lie, Raymond said, anger flaring again. Of course it is, Calvin agreed. But here's where it gets interesting. I've been contacted by 3 different flight attendants from that airline who want to share similar stories. Apparently, this isn't an isolated incident. They have a pattern of accommodating wealthy white passengers at the expense of others. Raymond wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still stung. What about Jasmine? The flight attendant who tried to help us? She's reached out through her own attorney, Calvin confirmed. She's willing to go on record about what happened and about other incidents she's witnessed. Raymond, we have a solid case here. Discrimination, negligence, infliction of emotional distress that resulted in physical harm to Evelyn. As they discussed legal strategies, a nurse brought in a tablet showing a live news broadcast. Greg Wilson was giving an interview, his wrist now sporting an elaborate bandage as if he'd suffered a severe injury rather than a minor scratch. I feared for my safety, Wilson was saying, his expression solemn. When I simply tried to resolve a seating misunderstanding, he became aggressive. Look what he did to me. He held up his bandaged wrist dramatically. Raymond watched in disbelief as Wilson spun a completely fictional account of what had transpired. He's lying through his teeth, he muttered. Calvin's voice hardened over the phone. We expected this. But here's what you need to know, Wilson isn't just a random entitled passenger. He's a major political donor with connections to the airline's board of directors. He has a history of complaints against service workers, particularly people of color. This information added another layer to Raymond's understanding of the incident. It hadn't just been about first-class seats. It had been about power, privilege, and the expectation that someone like Greg Wilson would always get his way, especially at the expense of someone like Raymond. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. It was the local attorney Calvin had arranged, Monique Dubois, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s with a briefcase and a determined expression. Dr. Johnson. I'm here to help, she said in accented English. And I'm afraid you'll need it. The airline is preparing to counter any claims you might make. As Raymond ended his call with Calvin and prepared to speak with Monique, Evelyn stirred in her hospital bed. Raymond, she said, her voice stronger than before, I want you to fight this. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been in our position and didn't have the resources to fight back. Raymond looked at his wife of 40 years. The woman who had supported him through medical school, who had stood by his side through countless slights and indignities, who had helped him navigate a world that often viewed him with suspicion despite his accomplishments. Even now, lying in a hospital bed after a heart attack, her concern was for justice. I will, he promised, squeezing her hand. We will. Outside the window, the lights of Paris began to twinkle as evening fell. Their anniversary trip had taken a devastating turn, but as Raymond sat beside Evelyn, reviewing the incident with Monique Dubois, he felt a growing resolve. For too long, he had swallowed his anger, had chosen the path of least resistance, had told himself that success was the best revenge. But some injustices demanded a response. Some battles needed to be fought, not just for personal vindication but for the principle of the thing. For the next passenger who might be asked to move because they didn't look like they belonged. As night fell over Paris, Raymond Johnson prepared for battle. The next morning dawned with Evelyn showing significant improvement. The French cardiologists were pleased with her progress, though they advised against flying for at least a week. Raymond sat by her bedside, reviewing strategy with Calvin via video call and Monique in person. Their hotel had extended their stay indefinitely, and colleagues from Atlanta had arranged to cover Raymond's patients. The airline is in full damage control mode, Calvin explained, his face serious on the screen. They've hired a crisis management firm and are pushing the narrative that this was simply a misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily. A misunderstanding? Raymond scoffed. They explicitly asked us to give up our seats for white passengers who felt entitled to them. Monique nodded, making notes. This is why witness testimony is crucial. The video shows much of the interaction, but not the specific language used. Warren, the attorney who recorded everything, has provided his complete footage, Calvin said. And he's given statements to several news outlets. But even more damning, we've had 6 airline employees reach out anonymously with stories of similar incidents and discriminatory practices. Raymond leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of practices? According to these sources, the airline has an unofficial policy they call passenger prioritization. They identify high-value customers who receive preferential treatment, upgraded seats, special accommodations, etc. On the surface, it's about rewarding loyalty and big spenders, but in practice, it's about catering to wealthy white passengers at the expense of others, Raymond finished. Exactly, Calvin confirmed. One flight attendant claimed they're actually trained to identify passengers who look out of place in premium cabins and verify their tickets more rigorously. The revelation didn't surprise Raymond, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach turn. How many other black passengers had experienced similar treatment but lacked the resources or platform to fight back? What do you think about these unofficial airline policies? Comment number 1: If you believe companies should be held accountable for discriminatory practices, even unofficial ones. Hit like if you agree that exposing these systems is the first step toward changing them. But what do you think happens when powerful people are challenged this way? Raymond's phone buzzed with a news alert. The airline's CEO, James Harrington, was giving a press conference. They turned on the hospital room's television to watch. At Transglobal Airlines, we take allegations of discrimination extremely seriously, Harrington said, his expression appropriately grave. The incident on Flight 2207 was an unfortunate misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily. We are conducting a thorough investigation and have reached out to all parties involved to resolve this matter. Reached out? Raymond said incredulously. They haven't contacted us at all. Harrington continued, we pride ourselves on providing excellent service to all our passengers regardless of race, gender, or background. The safety and comfort of our passengers remain our top priority. The carefully crafted statement was clearly designed to minimize liability while appearing concerned. Raymond had seen this playbook before: deny, deflect, and wait for the public's short attention span to move on to the next outrage. But this time would be different. This time, he had evidence, witnesses, and a platform. Calvin's face on the screen looked grimly satisfied. They're scared, Raymond. Their stock dropped 4% this morning. Hashtags like hashtag boycott Transglobal and hashtag flying while black are trending worldwide. They're feeling the pressure. Just then, Raymond's email pinged with a new message. It was from Jasmine Roberts, the flight attendant who had slipped him her contact information. Dr. Johnson, the email began, I hope this finds you and Mrs. Johnson recovering from yesterday's horrible incident. I want you to know that I've given my statement to your attorney and am willing to testify about what I witnessed. Also, you should know that an internal memo went out this morning warning staff not to discuss the incident publicly. But that's not all. I've discovered that Mr. Wilson specifically requested not to be seated near certain types of passengers when he checked in. The gate agent's notes explicitly mentioned this request, which violates our non-discrimination policies. I've saved screenshots before they can be deleted. I may lose my job for this, but some things are more important than a paycheck. Raymond forwarded the email to Calvin and Monique, who exchanged meaningful glances. This is significant, Monique said. It proves premeditation and explicit racial bias. As the day progressed, support continued to pour in from unexpected quarters. The president of the National Medical Association, representing black physicians across America, issued a statement condemning the airline's treatment of the Johnsons. Civil rights organizations reached out offering support and resources. Even some of TransGlobal's corporate partners issued statements expressing concern about the incident. But alongside the support came backlash. Raymond's hospital administration called, their tone noticeably strained. "We support you completely, of course," the chief of medicine said, his voice suggesting otherwise, "but we're concerned about the publicity affecting the hospital. Perhaps there's a way to resolve this quietly." Raymond understood the subtext immediately. Even now, as the victim of discrimination, he was expected to be the bigger person, to protect the comfort of the institution, to handle things quietly rather than cause a scene. "I appreciate your concern," Raymond replied coolly, "but this isn't just about me and Evelyn. It's about a pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed publicly." After hanging up, he discovered that his private practice had received dozens of cancellations, patients uncomfortable with the controversy or, more likely, revealing their own biases now that Raymond was in the spotlight. Evelyn noticed his troubled expression. "What is it?" "The practice is losing patients," he admitted. "And the hospital wants me to settle this quietly." Evelyn's expression hardened. "After 40 years of you building that practice. After all you've contributed to that hospital. This is exactly why you need to fight." She was right, of course. This reaction, the expectation that he should endure discrimination silently to maintain peace, to protect white comfort, was precisely the problem. Late that afternoon, Calvin called with news. TransGlobal has made an offer. $2 million to settle immediately, with a non-disclosure agreement. Raymond and Evelyn exchanged glances. It was a substantial sum, enough to compensate for any financial losses from Raymond's practice, enough to ensure their retirement remained comfortable despite this setback. "And if we refuse?" Raymond asked. "They'll fight," Calvin said bluntly. "They'll drag this out, question your character, suggest you were aggressive. They've already been digging. They know about that malpractice suit from 10 years ago. The one that was dismissed entirely?" Raymond asked incredulously. "Facts won't matter in the court of public opinion," Calvin warned. "They'll use everything they can to discredit you." Raymond fell silent, considering the implications. The path ahead would be difficult, potentially damaging to his reputation and practice. The easy option, taking the money, signing the NDA, moving on, was tempting. As if reading his thoughts, Evelyn spoke up. "If we sign that NDA, everything Jasmine risked her job to expose disappears. The pattern continues." Raymond nodded slowly. "Tell them we're not interested in hush money. We want accountability and systemic change." After ending the call, Raymond opened his email to find a message from an unexpected source. The subject line read, "Your stand inspired me. Dar. Johnson," the email began, "You don't know me, but I'm a second-year medical student at Emory. I'm black, and I've spent my entire life being told I don't belong in spaces not meant for me. Watching you refuse to move, refuse to accept that humiliation, gave me strength. Yesterday, a professor suggested I might be more comfortable specializing in community medicine rather than neurosurgery. Instead of nodding and smiling like I usually do, I stood my ground. I told him my interest in neurosurgery was firm and that his assumptions about where I'd be comfortable were inappropriate. I couldn't have done that without seeing your example. Thank you for showing me that we don't have to accept being displaced, literally or figuratively. Whatever happens with your case, please know you've already created change." Raymond read the email twice, then handed the phone to Evelyn. Her eyes filled with tears as she read. "This is why we fight," she said simply. That evening, as news coverage of the incident continued to build, James Harrington, the airline CEO, requested a private meeting with Raymond. Calvin advised against it, but Raymond was curious about what Harrington might say outside the presence of attorneys and PR teams. The meeting was arranged for the following morning at the hospital. As Raymond prepared for bed in the cot beside Evelyn's hospital bed, he felt a strange calm descend. Whatever Harrington might offer or threaten, Raymond's path was clear now. This wasn't just about 2 seats on an airplane anymore. It was about challenging a system that had been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. It was about standing his ground, not just for himself and Evelyn, but for that medical student, for Jasmine, and for countless others who had been told, in ways both subtle and overt, that they didn't belong. 2 days later, with Evelyn stable enough to be discharged to their hotel, Raymond and Calvin filed a formal lawsuit against Transglobal Airlines. The charges were comprehensive: racial discrimination, assault, medical negligence, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The filing made international headlines, with legal experts weighing in on news programs worldwide. This case has the potential to set significant precedent regarding how airlines handle seating disputes and discrimination claims, one analyst noted on CNN. Transglobal's response was swift and aggressive. Not only did they deny all allegations, but they also filed a countersuit claiming Raymond had been the aggressor, had assaulted Greg Wilson, and had disrupted flight operations. Their legal filing painted Raymond as an entitled, angry passenger who had refused reasonable crew instructions. The preliminary hearing was scheduled in Paris, given the jurisdiction where the incident occurred. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and supporters from both France and the United States. Raymond and Evelyn sat with dignity at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Calvin and Monique. Across the aisle, Transglobal's legal team. 6 attorneys from an international law firm known for aggressive defense tactics, conferred in hushed tones. Behind them sat James Harrington and several airline executives, their expressions carefully neutral. Greg and Patricia Wilson were notably absent, having filed affidavits rather than appearing in person. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Marie Clement, entered and surveyed the crowded courtroom with obvious displeasure at the circus-like atmosphere. "This court will not be influenced by media attention or public sentiment," she announced firmly. "We will proceed based solely on facts and applicable law." The initial presentations laid out both sides' claims. Transglobal's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Richard Bennett, spoke confidently. "Your Honor, this case is quite simple. Mr. Johnson refused to comply with crew instructions during boarding, became confrontational, and physically assaulted another passenger. Airlines have both the right and obligation to remove disruptive passengers for safety reasons. Race played no role in this standard security procedure." Calvin countered forcefully, presenting Warren's complete video footage, which clearly showed the discriminatory nature of the request and the minor nature of the so-called assault. "The video speaks for itself, Your Honor," Calvin said. Dr. and Mrs. Johnson were seated in their assigned seats, which they had purchased months in advance. They were asked to move solely to accommodate Mr. Wilson, who felt entitled to their seats despite having economy tickets. When Dr. Johnson rightfully refused, he was threatened, insulted with racially coded language, and ultimately removed from the flight. Mrs. Johnson subsequently suffered a heart attack due to the stress of this discriminatory treatment. Judge Clement watched the video with a furrowed brow, occasionally making notes. "I'd like to hear from witnesses," she said when the video concluded. Jasmine Roberts was the first to testify, having flown in specifically for the hearing. Despite the professional risk, she spoke clearly about what she had witnessed. Mr. Wilson had complained at the gate about his economy seat assignment, she testified. He specifically mentioned not wanting to sit near certain people and demanded an upgrade. When told first class was full, he became angry and mentioned his connections to the airline's board. "And what happened next?" Calvin asked. "Supervisor Blake instructed us to find seats in first class to accommodate an important client. When I pointed out all seats were occupied by paying passengers, he said to focus on." Jasmine hesitated. "Please continue," Judge Clement encouraged. "He said to focus on passengers who might have been upgraded or who didn't look like typical first-class passengers," Jasmine finished, her discomfort with the instruction evident. Richard Bennett's cross-examination was aggressive, questioning Jasmine's memory, motives, and professionalism. "Isn't it true that you were recently passed over for promotion and might harbor resentment toward the airline?" "Objection," Calvin interjected. Witness's career trajectory is irrelevant to what she observed. Sustained, Judge Clement ruled. "Mr. Bennett, please focus on the incident at hand." Warren Mitchell testified next, providing context for his video recording. "I began recording because I recognized a pattern I've seen before," he explained. "As an attorney who has handled discrimination cases, the coded language and differential treatment were immediately apparent to me." Throughout the day, additional witnesses corroborated key aspects of Raymond and Evelyn's account. A passenger seated near the Johnsons confirmed hearing Greg Wilson's "know your place" comment. Another flight attendant testified about the airline's unofficial passenger prioritization practices. Perhaps most damaging was the testimony from a transglobal gate agent who confirmed receiving special instructions regarding the Wilsons. "We were told they were VIPs who needed to be accommodated at all costs," she admitted. "It's not the first time we've received such instructions about Mr. Wilson specifically." By the day's end, Judge Clement had seen enough to make an initial ruling. "Based on the evidence presented, I find sufficient grounds for this case to proceed to full trial. The video evidence, in particular, contradicts the airline's characterization of events." She fixed Transglobal's legal team with a stern look. "Additionally, I am troubled by allegations that security footage from the gate area has been lost. I am ordering immediate preservation of all evidence related to this incident." As they left the courthouse, Raymond felt cautiously optimistic. The judge had seen through Transglobal's attempt to dismiss the case, and public opinion was largely on their side. But he also knew the fight was far from over. Back at their hotel, Raymond received a disturbing call from his practice manager in Atlanta. "I'm sorry to tell you this," she said, her voice strained, "but we've lost nearly 30% of our patients in the past week. Some colleagues have also requested to dissociate from the practice." The news hit Raymond hard. The cardiology practice he'd built over decades was suffering because he'd stood up for himself. Some colleagues, people he'd worked alongside for years, were distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with the controversy. Evelyn, still recovering but regaining her strength daily, found him on the hotel balcony, staring out at the Paris skyline. "Bad news?" she asked gently. Raymond nodded, explaining the situation with his practice. "I knew there would be consequences, but this. You could still take their settlement offer," Evelyn suggested, though her tone made clear she wasn't advocating for it. "No one would blame you." Raymond considered it briefly. The financial security, the end to public scrutiny, the ability to return to his patients and the work he loved. It was tempting. His phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Dr. William Chen, Chief of Cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital, one of the top medical institutions in the world. "Dr. Johnson," the email read, "I've followed your situation with great interest and admiration. Your courage in standing up against discrimination reminds us all of our obligation to uphold human dignity, even at personal cost. I'm reaching out to offer you a position as a senior attending physician and professor of medicine at MGH. We would be honored to have a physician of your caliber and character join our team." The offer was prestigious and would solve the practical problems created by the damage to his Atlanta practice. But it would also mean leaving the community he'd served for decades. And more importantly, accepting would require dropping the lawsuit, as he couldn't manage a new position while engaged in international litigation. Raymond showed the email to Evelyn. "What do you think?" She read it carefully before responding. "It's a generous offer, and it solves some problems. But Raymond, this was never just about us. If we walk away now, what happens to the next couple who doesn't have our resources or platform?" Raymond nodded slowly. The question that had guided his entire career, what was the right thing to do, not just the easy thing, applied here as well. "We see this through," he decided. no matter the cost. That night, as they prepared for bed, Calvin called with a startling development. An anonymous transglobal employee had provided internal communications showing a deliberate effort to appease Greg Wilson at the Johnsons' expense. These emails confirm Wilson contacted Harrington directly before the flight, Calvin explained. They knew exactly who would be displaced and why. This wasn't a random incident, it was premeditated discrimination. The evidence was damning, proving not only that the airline had targeted the Johnsons specifically but that they had done so knowing it violated their own policies. The trial, set to begin in 3 weeks, now had the potential to expose not just one incident of discrimination but an entire system designed to privilege certain passengers at the expense of others. As Raymond drifted off to sleep that night, he thought about the young medical student who had emailed him, about Jasmine risking her career to testify, about the patients who had left his practice and those who had staunchly remained. The path ahead was difficult, but for the first time since the incident, he felt certain they were making the right choice. Sometimes, standing your ground meant accepting that the ground beneath you might shift. But principles, the true north of one's moral compass, remained constant. That certainty carried Raymond into sleep, preparing him for the battle to come. The trial began on a crisp Monday morning, 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing. Media interest had only intensified, with the case now seen as a potential landmark in discrimination law. Outside the courthouse, supporters held signs reading, "Justice for the Johnsons," and "End discrimination in the skies." Inside, Raymond and Evelyn sat composed as Calvin delivered a powerful opening statement. This case, he told the courtroom, is about more than 2 seats on an airplane. It's about whether companies can maintain policies and practices that result in discriminatory treatment, then hide behind claims of misunderstanding when those practices are exposed. Over the next 3 days, witness after witness took the stand, building a comprehensive picture of what had occurred on Flight 2207 and the corporate culture that had enabled it. Transglobal's attorneys fought fiercely, challenging testimonies and attempting to shift focus to Raymond's alleged aggressive behavior. On the 4th day, Greg Wilson himself took the stand, having been compelled to appear by the court. Impeccably dressed and clearly coached by Transglobal's legal team, he projected confident indignation. "I simply requested the seats I believe I was entitled to as a loyal customer," Wilson testified. Dar. Johnson became immediately confrontational and ultimately assaulted me. He held up his wrist, though any trace of the minor scratch had long since healed. Calvin's cross-examination was methodical and devastating. "Mr. Wilson, are you aware that your original booking was for economy class seats?" "I frequently receive upgrades due to my status," Wilson replied smoothly. "And when you were told the flight was full, did you or did you not state that you didn't want to sit near certain people?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "I don't recall making any such statement." Calvin approached with a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence Exhibit 27, gate agent notes from the check-in counter." He handed copies to the judge and defense. "Mr. Wilson, according to these contemporaneous notes, you specifically requested not to be seated near certain types of passengers and became agitated when told this wasn't possible. Can you explain what you meant by certain types of passengers?" Wilson's composure cracked slightly. "I simply meant disruptive passengers. I travel frequently and prefer a peaceful environment." "And how exactly would you identify these potentially disruptive passengers before they had displayed any disruptive behavior?" Calvin pressed. That's not." Wilson stumbled, then rallied. "Look, I'm a valued customer who spends hundreds of thousands of dollars with Transglobal annually. Is it so wrong to expect preferential treatment? Even at the expense of other paying customers?" Calvin asked. "Even when that preferential treatment is based on assumptions about who belongs in first class?" Wilson's face flushed with anger. "Those seats are for people who understand their value. Not for people who just got lucky with an upgrade or who are trying to prove some point about equality." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Wilson seemed to realize immediately he'd revealed too much, but the damage was done. "No further questions, Your Honor," Calvin said quietly, allowing Wilson's words to hang in the air. The next significant testimony came from James Harrington, TransGlobal's CEO, who had clearly hoped to avoid taking the stand. Under Calvin's questioning, he was forced to acknowledge the airline's passenger prioritization policies. "These are standard industry practices," Harrington insisted. "All airlines provide special treatment to their most valuable customers. Even when that special treatment means displacing other paying customers based on subjective criteria?" Calvin asked. "Our crews make judgment calls based on multiple factors," Harrington replied carefully. "Including how passengers look. Whether they seem like they belong in premium cabins." Harrington's hesitation was telling. "That's not our official policy." "But it is the practice, isn't it, Mr. Harrington?" Calvin pressed, presenting internal training materials that instructed staff to identify passengers who might be more willing to accept reassignment. As the trial progressed, Blake and Heather, the flight attendants who had confronted the Johnsons, gave testimony that contradicted both each other and the video evidence. Their credibility crumbled under cross-examination, particularly when Heather admitted she had initially assumed the Johnsons were in the wrong seats without checking their boarding passes. By the end of the week, Judge Clement made an unusual mid-trial statement. "I feel compelled to note," she said, "that the evidence presented thus far suggests troubling patterns that extend beyond this single incident. This court takes allegations of discriminatory practices very seriously." Her comment sent shockwaves through TransGlobal's executive team. That evening, news broke that the airline's board had convened an emergency session, and its stock had dropped another 8%. Raymond and Evelyn returned to their hotel room that evening to find a message from Calvin. TransGlobal was offering a new settlement, $10 million, no NDA, and a commitment to review their seating policies. "They're running scared," Calvin explained when they called him. "Harrington's testimony was a disaster, and the board knows it. This offer is substantially better than their previous one." Raymond and Evelyn discussed the offer late into the night. $10 million would more than compensate for the damage to Raymond's practice. The absence of an NDA meant they could speak freely about their experience. The policy review, while vague, was at least an acknowledgement of the systemic issues. "What do you think?" Raymond asked Evelyn, who had made a remarkable recovery but still tired easily. "I think they're trying to make this go away before even more damaging information comes out," she replied thoughtfully. "The question is whether this outcome achieves what we want." Raymond wasn't sure. The settlement would provide personal resolution, but would it create lasting change? Would it prevent future incidents? As he pondered these questions, his phone chimed with a new email. It was another message from the medical student who had contacted him earlier. Attached was a letter signed by over 500 black medical students and professionals across the country, expressing gratitude for his stand and sharing their own experiences of discrimination in professional settings. "Your courage has started a national conversation," the email read. "Whatever you decide about the case, please know that you've already created change by refusing to accept treatment that so many of us have silently endured." The letter moved Raymond deeply. While deliberating, he received a text from Warren Mitchell, "Check your email. Just sent something important." The email contained a video link to a recording of a private conversation between James Harrington and several board members, apparently taken during a break in the trial. "We need to settle this before the policies come under more scrutiny," Harrington was saying. "The Johnsons are just the tip of the iceberg. If this goes further, we could face a class action from other passengers who've been similarly treated." "Can we contain this to just seating issues?" a board member asked. "I'm more concerned about the hiring and promotion patterns that might come to light," another replied. "Our diversity numbers are abysmal, especially in leadership." The recording continued, revealing that TransGlobal's discriminatory practices extended far beyond seating arrangements, affecting hiring, promotion, and vendor selection throughout the company. Raymond immediately forwarded the recording to Calvin, who called back within minutes. "This changes everything," Calvin said excitedly. "This isn't just about your case anymore. This is systematic discrimination across their entire operation." The next morning, as Raymond and Evelyn prepared to return to court, they received yet another surprising communication, a request for a private meeting from Harrington himself. Against Calvin's advice, Raymond agreed to meet the CEO in a conference room at their hotel, with attorneys present. Harrington looked haggard, the strain of the trial evident on his face. "Dr. Johnson," he began without preamble, "I'll be direct. The board has lost confidence in my leadership. I'm being asked to step down regardless of the trial outcome." Raymond listened silently as Harrington continued. "The settlement offer on the table is genuine. The board is prepared to make significant changes, not just to seating policies but to hiring practices, training, everything. They understand now that the risk isn't just this case but potential class actions and regulatory investigations." "Why are you telling me this?" Raymond asked. Harrington sighed heavily. "Because I want you to know that whatever you decide, change is coming to Transglobal. Your stand has accomplished that much already." As Harrington left, Raymond and Evelyn were left with a decision that had grown both simpler and more complex. The trial had already achieved more than they had initially hoped, exposing systemic issues and forcing leadership changes. But was a settlement, even a generous one, sufficient justice for what they had endured? The answer came to Raymond as he recalled the words from the medical student's email: "You've already created change by refusing to accept treatment that so many of us have silently endured." Sometimes, justice wasn't just about personal vindication but about creating a precedent that protected others. With newfound clarity, Raymond knew exactly what they needed to do. The courtroom fell silent as Raymond Johnson took the stand on what would be the final day of the trial. After 2 weeks of testimony and evidence, Judge Clement had asked both parties if they had reached any settlement agreement. To everyone's surprise, Raymond had requested the opportunity to address the court before responding. "Dr. Johnson," Judge Clement said, "you may proceed." Raymond surveyed the packed courtroom. The attorneys, the media, the Transglobal executives, and most importantly, Evelyn, whose supportive smile gave him strength. "Your Honor," he began, "I want to explain why we've decided to reject Transglobal's financial settlement offer." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Calvin looked startled, though they had discussed this strategy. "Throughout my career as a physician, I've been guided by a simple principle: treat the cause, not just the symptoms. A financial settlement, no matter how substantial, would address only the symptoms of a much deeper problem." Raymond glanced at the Transglobal board members, who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Instead, we are proposing an alternative resolution, one that treats the cause. Rather than monetary damages, we want Transglobal to commit to comprehensive structural changes. Specifically, we're asking for a complete overhaul of training procedures, hiring practices, and seating policies, to be overseen by an independent civil rights committee." Judge Clement leaned forward, intrigued. "This is an unusual request, Dr. Johnson. Most plaintiffs in your position would accept the substantial damages offered." "I understand that, Your Honor. But this case has never been about money. It's about dignity, respect, and ensuring that what happened to us doesn't happen to others. No amount of money can compensate for the humiliation my wife and I experienced, or for her heart attack triggered by that stress. But structural change might prevent another couple from going through the same ordeal." The judge turned to Transglobal's legal team. "Does your client have a response to this proposal?" After a hurried conference with the board members present, Richard Bennett stood. "Your Honor, given the unusual nature of this request, we would need time to consider the specific terms." "I understand," Judge Clement replied. "I'll give both parties 48 hours to negotiate these terms before rendering a decision." Those 48 hours proved transformative. With Judge Clement's encouragement, both sides worked intensively to draft an agreement that would address the systemic issues exposed during the trial. By the deadline, they had reached a historic settlement. TransGlobal would establish a $50 million fund for anti-discrimination initiatives and training. The airline would overhaul its hiring and promotion practices to increase diversity at all levels. An independent civil rights committee would oversee these changes for a minimum of 5 years. The passenger prioritization policy would be replaced with transparent, non-discriminatory seating procedures. James Harrington would step down as CEO, to be replaced by Diane Foster, a respected black female executive with a background in corporate ethics. When Judge Clement approved the settlement 2 days later, she called it a model for how corporations can address discriminatory practices in a meaningful way rather than simply paying damages to make problems disappear. The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Harrington resigned the following day, and Diane Foster was announced as his replacement. In her first press conference, she pledged to transform TransGlobal's corporate culture. "This isn't just about avoiding lawsuits," Foster stated firmly. "It's about building an airline that treats every passenger and employee with dignity and respect." One of Foster's first actions was to promote Jasmine Roberts to a leadership position in the newly formed diversity initiative. "Ms. Roberts showed extraordinary courage in coming forward," Foster noted. "That's exactly the kind of integrity we need in leadership roles." Greg Wilson faced his own consequences. As his comments during the trial became public, his company faced boycotts and his political connections distanced themselves. After weeks of mounting pressure, he issued a public apology, though many questioned its sincerity. "I've been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about my own biases," Wilson's statement read. "I am committed to doing better." For Raymond and Evelyn, the return to Atlanta brought both challenges and triumphs. While some patients and colleagues had permanently distanced themselves, many more rallied around them. The practice gradually stabilized, with new patients specifically seeking out Raymond because of his stand against discrimination. Using his platform and a portion of the legal fees TransGlobal was required to pay, Raymond established the Johnson Scholarship for minority medical students facing economic or social barriers. "Medicine needs diverse perspectives," he explained at the scholarship launch. "Every patient deserves a doctor who understands their unique experiences." Warren Mitchell, the attorney who had recorded the original incident, became a close friend. Together, they collaborated on a documentary about racial profiling in commercial settings, using the TransGlobal case as its centerpiece. Perhaps most significantly, TransGlobal implemented what became known as the Raymond Johnson Protocol for handling seating disputes. The protocol established clear, non-discriminatory procedures and required extensive documentation for any passenger reassignment. 1 year after the incident, Raymond and Evelyn finally took their delayed anniversary trip. A Mediterranean cruise they had been planning before the fateful flight. Before departing, they received a surprise invitation from TransGlobal to witness the airline's transformed approach. With some trepidation, they accepted, finding themselves once again at an airport gate. This time, however, they were greeted personally by Diane Foster and a team of executives who gave them a tour of the new training facilities where flight crews learned about unconscious bias and inclusive customer service. Their final stop was a first-class cabin on a demonstration aircraft, where they found Jasmine, now a flight supervisor, training a diverse group of new attendants. "Welcome aboard, Dr. and Mrs. Johnson," she said warmly. "We've been expecting you." The captain, a young black woman, emerged from the cockpit to greet them personally. "It's an honor to meet you both," she said. "What you did changed things for all of us." As they settled into their seats, the very type of seats they had been asked to surrender a year earlier, Raymond reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The humiliation and anger had faded, replaced by a sense of purpose fulfilled. They hadn't just stood their ground, they had changed the terrain. Back in Atlanta the following week, Raymond addressed a new class of medical residents at the hospital. Looking out at their eager, diverse faces, he shared the most important lesson from his experience. There will be moments in your career, and in your life, when you'll have to decide whether to accept injustice for the sake of peace or stand firm for the sake of principle. Those decisions will define not just who you are, but the world you help create for others. A young black resident raised her hand. Weren't you afraid of the consequences? Of losing your practice or damaging your reputation? Raymond nodded thoughtfully. Of course I was afraid. Standing up always carries risk. But I've learned that the cost of silence is ultimately greater than the cost of speaking out. Every time we accept discrimination as just the way things are, we ensure it remains that way. After the session, Raymond found Evelyn waiting for him. 41 years of marriage now, and still his strongest supporter. They walked hand in hand through the hospital corridors where he had spent so much of his career. No regrets, she asked, knowing the answer but asking anyway. Raymond squeezed her hand. Not one. What would you have done in Raymond's situation? Would you have accepted the financial settlement or pushed for systemic change like he did? Comment below with your thoughts. If this story of courage and standing up against discrimination moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, change begins when one person refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. Thank you for watching, and may we all find the courage to stand our ground when it matters most. Raymond and Evelyn's story teaches us that dignity is non-negotiable, regardless of one's age, profession, or social status. Their experience reveals how racial discrimination often hides behind seemingly neutral policies and customer service decisions. While standing up against discrimination carries risks, professional, financial, and personal, the cost of silence is ultimately greater than the cost of speaking out. The story also highlights the importance of allies like Warren, Jasmine, and Calvin, who used their positions to support justice. Without their courage, Raymond's fight might have been dismissed as an isolated incident rather than exposing a systemic problem. Perhaps most powerfully, the story demonstrates that true change requires more than individual compensation. By rejecting financial settlement in favor of structural reform, Raymond and Evelyn created lasting impact that protected countless others from similar experiences. They transformed their humiliation into a force for positive change. Their journey reminds us that sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about personal vindication, it's about reshaping the terrain for everyone who follows. What would you have done in Raymond's situation? Would you have accepted the financial settlement or pushed for systemic change like he did? Comment below with your thoughts. If this story of courage and standing up against discrimination moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, change begins when one person refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. Thank you for watching, and may we all find the courage to stand our ground when it matters most.